from the sort of early 90s, we started to get concerned that our resident birds were declining. In 2003, we did the first national survey, and we've repeated that at 10-year intervals. So when we did that first survey in 2003, we estimated 78,000 breeding males. In last year's survey, we estimated about 50,000.
So those numbers are going down quite fast.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in the country do they breed?
So they breed across most of Britain and Ireland, with the exception of the far west. So typically those places where you see the highest numbers in winter, Devon, Cornwall, Pembrokeshire, and parts of the western fringes of Scotland, but otherwise anywhere where you've got reasonable sized woodland. So they don't like very small blocks of woodland, they're going for the larger, something at least 40 hectares ideally, that sort of size of woodland. And they're very particular about where they breed. You can see them pretty much anywhere in winter, flush one under a hedge, as you well know, or the centre of a bramble thicket in a woodland. But when they're breeding, they tend to nest in more sparse open woodland to nest, but then they take the chicks into thicker, shrubbier areas. And because of those roding flights, those are males seeking females. They need some open spaces to see the females and attract them.
And what can we do to improve the resident population in the UK?
So the national surveys have helped because we've had at least 800 volunteers. This last survey we had 1,200 volunteers right across the country counting roding woodcock. And we can relate those counts to the size of the woodland, the type of habitat. So we've asked them to do some fairly rudimentary habitat recording. But these days with computer systems, you can actually drill right down and look at the type of woodland, but also how it's changed over those 20 years that we've been doing surveys.
Now, my problem with what you've done, because I mean everything about it is entirely laudable and wonderful, and the science is extremely impressive, is that you have chosen to talk about the UK population of woodcock, and they are found from here to Japan. I mean, they are one of the most widely distributed birds in the world, aren't they? So they're not internationally threatened, are they?
No, not at all. No, probably globally one of the most successful bird species, ironically. So we have a global population of 15, 16 million woodcock, and as you say, they breed. We're right on the western fringe in Britain, but they breed right through Central Europe, Russia, right through the Urals into Siberia, and then not quite so far east, but then some of those central Russian breeding birds do migrate west to Japan. So you can see them pretty much anywhere in the world between about 50 and between about 40 and 60 degrees north.
And of course in America there's the American woodcock, which is similar. Is it a ring species? Do they actually breed? Could they interbreed?
No, they don't. To our knowledge, they've never interbred, so the American woodcock's about 2/3 the size of ours.
Right. Okay. So the problem for me is that we find that the conservation industry will not you specifically, but other parts of it will use a species that is on the western edge of its distribution, like for example the searle bunting, and kind of create a conservation hostage situation out of it. And they will say, because they are declining in the UK in the breeding population, we must therefore get some money to do something about it, or we must therefore ban people from shooting them. And this translates into our fuzzy-minded shooting estate world of people saying, we don't shoot woodcock here, which I find annoying because there are lots of them.
And I've never said you mustn't shoot woodcock.
Okay, well that's
so,
good.
I'm very clear on that. As I started off with, 20 years ago we got concerned about the decline in our resident birds, but as we've just discussed, globally, there's no threat to the species, and even if we lost them from Britain, globally the species will be secure. We might see fewer in winter. And others, you're absolutely right, have latched on to that. Those that don't like what we do in winter have latched on to the fact that well, perhaps shooting's part of the cause of that decline.
I think it goes even further. I mean, the BTO has come up with, the British Trust for Ornithology has come up with its traffic light system for UK species and calls the woodcock Red Listed. Yes. And yet the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which runs the as efficient as it can get traffic light system, says least conservation concern. So you've got BTO on one side and IUCN on the other. And I think, although I can see it's not your intention, it seems to me that shoots are slipping down the Chris Packham path.
So I think we need to get the message out. And as I say, I've never said don't shoot woodcock. But 20 years there's clear concern. The reason that woodcock is red listed is there is clear range contraction, so a contraction in the distribution of breeding woodcock. And we know from our national surveys that numbers are declining. But we don't think that shooting is the driver of that. And actually now we have pretty good evidence. So we've done work with stable isotopes in feathers, which give you a rough postcode, if you like, to within 100 kilometres of where that bird was hatched or molted at the end of its breeding season. And we know from that about 9% of woodcock in the UK bag are resident birds. And we can translate that based on numbers shot to say that sort of 7 to 8% of the British breeding population are actually shot each winter.
So is it habitat restoration? Is it all about habitat for saving the British woodcock, the British resident breeding woodcock?
I think so. So just to finish my previous point, 7 to 8% of that population are shot. So yes, people that shoot are adding to the annual mortality of that population. But typically for wader populations, birds the size of woodcock, they can tolerate 22%, mortality in winter. So we're well below that. Places that give me concern are those where you shoot large bags, particularly on a commercial basis in the west of Britain. But again, the number of people doing that are pretty small. So when you take that into the wash amongst the total bag across the country, it's pretty trivial against the numbers of birds that we see in winter.
And you did say that they don't tend to breed so much in the far west. So west of Cornwall, Isle of Islay, isn't it? That's a big.
Yes.
And of course, where they make landfall, Flamborough Head. Of course, those will be income as well.
Those sorts of places. Yes.
Okay. So you're not advocating stopping shooting. That's a joy to hear. I think we need to get that message out there a bit.
Yes.
I have got a patch of woodland that holds woodcock quite well. What can I do apart from burying the bodies of my enemies there and creating worm? What can I do to encourage more woodcock to come?
So if you want them in winter, good warm shrubby woodland helps. As in the breeding season, rides, clearings. I'm sure you've seen them flighting out on a winter's morning, first light. But also in winter, the surrounding agriculture can be quite important, and I appreciate that's often out of scope. But if you've got good cattle graze pasture, they'll like that because they're feeding mainly at night on earthworms and beetles, soil invertebrates in winter.
We see so many, when we're out rabbiting at night, we see so many woodcock just lifting off in front of us. So they seem to be absolutely everywhere. Yeah. Okay. One of the surprising benefits for British migrating woodcock has been the oil platforms of the North Sea. Tell me that story.
Yes, fascinating. Early in my career, I sent some photos in the post, and as you used to, how times have moved on. And yes, made contact with a guy on Papa Westray, I think it was, in the North Sea. Each autumn he'd see not just woodcock, goldcrest, goshawks, amazing numbers of birds. And when the weather was stormy, they'd land on the platform, particularly those dark, stormy nights. So I've seen pictures of 15, 20 woodcock all lined up round the outer rail of the platform. And we know from old game records as well about, particularly off Lowestoft, off the east coast of England, large, tides of woodcock washing ashore when there's been a major storm out at sea.
So they set off from continental Europe with an easterly behind them, and the weather changes, and they just fall dead into the water, don't they?
So we know from our satellite tracking work that exactly that. They do set off with a tailwind typically. So we've had tagged birds that have set off from Cornwall to France, got halfway across the channel and turned back because we don't know quite how they do it, but somehow they sense air pressure or they sense the time's not quite right. We had a bird in the autumn that bred in Norway, set off for Scotland. We knew it had wintered in Scotland the previous winter, got halfway, hit a storm and turned back, and we lost that bird in the sea. So the majority get it right, but some get caught out.
Yeah. Just on that, you run an interactive map, don't you? We can track your woodcock.
That's right. The technology's been fantastic, and better than I could have ever hoped in my lifetime. The insights we're getting from some of these birds into their migrations. So yes, we do have a Woodcock Watch website on the GWCT website. You can find it. But the technology's moved on from that relatively crude satellite tagging that gave us a location every couple of days. We've now got much smaller GPS tags. And what's interesting about those is we've put them on lapwings and curlews in Britain, and you can interpolate the sort of nesting behaviour and work out whether a bird has reared a brood successfully or not. So I'm now thinking we could apply that to woodcock, track birds to Russia, find out where they breed well, where they breed less well, and particularly in relation to seasonal weather. And ultimately in a few years' time we might be able to predict, well, it's been a good breeding season in Russia, we should see more woodcock, or we know conditions haven't been good and we can put the alert out that perhaps people are going to see fewer woodcock.
It would be good. I mean, I must say, from a media point of view, to know what the woodcock season would be like. I've always felt you should run a kind of woodcock Grand National for how far. And one of them went to Kazakhstan, didn't it? That's
right. Yes, amazing. Yes, so some of those track birds, typically they'll go 3,000 kilometres, so about 2,000 miles, but we had 3 individuals out of about 65 that went right out to Siberia, so getting on for 7,000 kilometres, about 5,500 miles. Incredible. We had one of those birds that did it 3 years running.
Do you know what height they fly at? Are they very high? Do they go up thousands of feet, or do they fly at about?
Typically, they're flying quite low, so the tags suggest about 300 metres. Peak altitude about 1,000 metres.
So we have heard about the enormous offshore wind farms that are about to be built. Is that going to be a threat? Do you predict?
I've heard a lot of concern about those wind farms. I think woodcock are probably flying high enough, but the issue will come, as we've discussed, with those storms. They're pushed lower and lower, and then they're not as able to avoid those turbines.
Andrew, you have won me round on many of those points. Thank you very much indeed for coming on and talking about woodcock.
Thank you.
Andrew Hoodless, GWCT.